Okay, Michelle, we're all ready for you.
So I have a question then. Should I have the rubric in front of me right now, or should I have?
No, because you're presenting.
Okay.
Others are going to provide feedback based on that rubric that I sent out.
Okay, and I'm going into this as this is a draft, not as a final.
Okay.
Is that well,
sure.
That's what it's going to be. So.
And if everyone else would just make sure to mute so we don't provide her with any static, and we will have questions. So are you able to share your slides, Michelle?
Sure. I will share my screen then.
Sorry, where is the rubric that we should be looking at?
Sorry, I was talking with you, Mahin. There's a copy of it on the dashboard when you go into our class under announcements. That's the easiest place to find it, or you can find it in one of the emails Dr. L sent. But I personally am going on to Blackboard and finding it.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Aye, aye, Captain.
We're already.
It's also available in the assignment section.
So I'm trying to minimize your faces, sorry, so I can see my screen. Can you see my screen at this point?
Yes.
Thank you. Great, so my project or question is conducting cross-disciplinary research is, excuse me one second, I gotta shut the door. Sorry, there's just noise outside of my room. Conducting for cross-disciplinary research, I am interested in the question about engaging patients for meaningful input in clinical trial design. As the way I see it, for the problem, there is a growing expectation that patients are engaged in clinical trial design. Clinical trials have engaged patients in design, have improved recruitment, retention, and patient satisfaction in outcomes being studied. So what we do know is that there are a number of studies that are engaging patients, and some studies have shown that through surveys that there is increased patient satisfaction. However, what we are also finding is that some researchers are engaging patients for the sake of checking a box and having what we might call tokenistic engagement from patients that may lack meaningful engagement. So I view the problem in that we need to evaluate the methods and strategies for meaningful patient engagement in clinical trial design so that we have meaningful engagement that improves clinical trial designs to answer research questions that are important to patients. Dr. L, should I just go through the whole thing, or am I pausing to get feedback and questions?
Yeah, you go through the whole thing.
Okay. Whoops. Whoops, sorry. I'm going the wrong way. So the reason why I think this problem needs to have a cross-disciplinary approach is in order to evaluate effective and meaningful patient engagement in clinical trials, we need to pull in multiple disciplines to address the complexity. Multiple stakeholders are involved in clinical trial design, product development, and dissemination of results. Contributors may have a common goal, but also the goals are specific to their own perspectives. Meaningful patient engagement involves the perspectives from patients, family and their carers, clinicians and healthcare providers, researchers, product manufacturers such as pharma and others in the pharmaceutical industry, advocacy groups and foundations, funders that may come from multiple sources, regulators, health services, and insurers. The stakeholders have different stakeholders from different disciplines are needed to identify, communicate, and understand perspectives so that ideas can be utilized in meaningful patient engagement. I think there are a lot of potentially relevant disciplines that could participate in this, from health policy, biomedical research, regulatory science, social sciences, medical ethics, health literacy and education, general communications, as well as business communications, business leadership and management, economics, medical anthropology, implementation science, and complexity science. So this is a pretty long list of disciplines. I think that to be effective, we'd have to narrow it down. In my literature review, I was able to look through PubMed, Scopus, and Embase and found a lot of literature on patient engagement and pertaining to clinical trial design and health services. I was also able to find patient engagement and the value of their engagement in both of those areas. Some of the perspectives included economics and value as in monetary value, as well as satisfaction surveys. So that brought in the financial and business perspective, but that was a very small amount of literature. There was a lot of social science perspectives. I also looked at a couple of other databases for public policy and business and was able to find a few things, but less in that area pertaining to clinical trials. So challenges in consulting multiple disciplines. That I found in my research is that biomedical disciplines describe patient engagement methods in clinical trials and in health services and in outcomes research. Most of the literature I found was under the biomedical discipline. Those biomedical disciplines, however, talked about how they engaged patients in their clinical trial through the life cycle. However, there was not very much information on the actual methods and whether or not one method was better than another. There was some literature that I found in the biomedical discipline on regulatory science and health services. Certainly the FDA is interested in patient engagement for product development, and health services research is interested in it for improvement of health outcomes. Other disciplines had, as I said before, had literature on patient engagement, but far less than in the biomedical disciplines. As I reflect back on this, I found that the literature in the biomedical area was really on how research teams engaged patients in their ongoing clinical trial, but it was more of a reflection on the way they did it rather than a way in which they would develop methods for better practices. In the social services disciplines, I saw that they sought perceptions from patients, researchers, clinicians, and other stakeholders through conducting surveys of their attitudes, whether it be attitudes of satisfaction and participation or satisfaction from the feedback provided by patients to the clinical trial development. And also surveys on the expectations for the type of input that was provided and how it would be used in the research development. In the health services disciplines, there was some literature on the engagement from a cost perspective and a time perspective, in that, excuse me, looking at the value of patient engagement in speeding up the clinical trial process and whether that would actually save cost in the long run. As I think about how to analyze and evaluate this, it seems that the biomedical literature looked more at specific conditions, and it was mostly around an academic environment where academics or researchers were including this. There was a growing body of literature in pharma incorporating patient engagement in their research. Social science disciplines certainly looked at attitudes and perceptions of both patients, researchers, and of course clinicians, but they did not address policy. In health education, there was some literature on training for clinicians and investigators on how to better incorporate patients into their designs so that their studies were more patient-centric. Training for patients was offered so that patients would have a better understanding of the clinical trial enterprise. There was not much to address education on cost and resources and what it would take to engage patients. From a health policy and regulatory perspective, there is some literature on best practices that are shared, and the FDA has put out a guidance to help guide researchers on this. What I found interesting is that there were some articles that were published that called what they did best practices. And yet there are few practices, which made me wonder how they determined that their one practice was better than any other, since there was no comparison. So I think that in the end, there is no standard process for engagement, and there is very little data that shows that there is better value from one method of patient engagement over another. Conflicts and common ground. There are certainly common ground in that patients and clinicians and researchers want improved health. From patients, there are advocacy groups who help support and advocate for the patients and make their voices heard and have a better way of making inroads with the researchers and funders. From a conflict perspective, there seems to be a difference in return on investments. Investors are looking for a monetary gain in that will patient engagement improve recruitment, improve retention, and speed time to study completion and marketing of their product. The researchers and patients have conflict in that sometimes they have differences in their goals. While they may agree on improved health outcome, the researcher tends to look at maybe tenure or getting a manuscript out, whereas the patient is really looking to see if their input actually shapes the way a trial is being done to improve their outcomes. Also, another conflict between patient and researcher is sometimes the researcher is more interested in an academic finding rather than answering a question for, say, quality of life, or that would be important to a patient. So again, for insights, I think that what I've seen is that methods for engaging patients really needs to be tailored to whatever the value it is that is being sought. So if you want faster results for recruitment or study completion, there may be methods that could be developed for engaging patients in that area. If someone is looking for improving outcomes, there may be a different type of patient engagement that is needed. Sources of conflict, I think there is a difference in academic interests and career goals for the researchers. There are source limitations of funding between commercial, government, and advocacy groups, whereas from a commercial perspective, they're looking for product fast time to market. The government is looking at broad health outcomes, and maybe advocacy groups are looking for specific improvements for perhaps quality of life. There are time pressures that everyone is facing, and from different perspectives, a patient might be looking for finding that one thing that will make a difference in their life, rather than a novel finding in pathophysiology of their disease. From a funder's perspective, they're looking at meeting their milestones for their investors or to file for licensure with the FDA. Researchers are looking to see whether they can meet their milestones because they need to be able to complete their project to move on to the next phase of their research. And then there are other disciplines that, while there may be conflicts, I think there are also benefits, because questions that they will bring are about what are the ethics for involving patients? Should we or should we not do that? And to what extent should they be participating in making decisions about how a researcher researches a particular scientific question? Same with social perspectives. I think there is a lot to be gained by thinking about all of the different perspectives from multiple disciplines, and then gaining community input as to what it is that patient engagement can do for the research enterprise. And I've got a blank slide here. So core ideas about creating common ground. I have a TBD here so that I can hope to get some feedback here about how to proceed on that. I have references, and I think that is the end.
Great. Thank you very much, Michelle, for that presentation. We're doing pretty good on time, actually. I think we can spend about 10 minutes talking about this presentation. Who wants to start from the group to give some feedback or have questions for Michelle?
I have a quick question. So I didn't see you anywhere explicitly say which of your disciplines were the most relevant. So did you just kind of focus on everything, or did you have specific ones?
I think that biomedical and social services are probably the most relevant.
Yeah.
Although I think that it would be great if there could be more of perhaps an economic perspective, but there just wasn't much there.
I had that problem too.
Okay. Anybody else?
Hi, Michelle. This is Louis.
Louis?
I think you did a fantastic job. I think there is definitely a big issue here that you have really highlighted that really needs enlightening in our field of research. I do think that you did a great job in incorporating the different perspectives like power and conflicts and functional perspectives, which I personally did not do. So I learned from your end that I should try and incorporate those ideas. But I think what Dr. L has told us in the past, I think we focus too much on for the purpose of this course, we focus too much on the stakeholders. And I don't blame us because that's just what we were trained to do so far. But what exactly between the stakeholders is closing the gap of that, of the issue at hand? So for instance, let's say, patients have this issue and doctors have or investigators have their own interests, but where in the in-between do they really close this gap? Maybe they might have one-on-one conversations like a manager or a reporting individual, or there's a forum in which patient advocacy groups will invite investigators or main stakeholders in that sense of tokenism that you have described as an issue, and so that those investigators can really learn from this issue and bridge this issue and learn in how to change and shape this translational aspect of your problem. In terms of the common ground, I think that would really knock it out the park. I think of it as an SOP, in a RACI chart, we see all the individuals who are responsible, but what exactly are they responsible? What is the process in between each of the individuals? And I think that might close a lot of the gaps that I personally have in my own presentation as well. But please correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. L.
Let me just add on to what you're saying. I might have a little delay, so bear with me here. Let's go back a little bit and discuss the relationship between a discipline of science and a stakeholder.
Yeah, I want to just say, if I had shared with you my slides not in presentation mode, you would have seen that I have a comment right there that says discipline versus stakeholders.
Right.
So
Okay,
I'm so glad you're asking me about this.
So let me ask this in the form of a question.
Thank you.
Did Repko and Stotek mean conflicts between stakeholders or conflicts between the way that disciplines look at problems?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
I'm just curious, anybody, which one do you think it was from the reading?
I thought it was more of conflicts between disciplines. That's how I addressed mine. And to be honest, I don't think I focused too much on the stakeholders, but that was more from going on the slide, slide outline.
Okay, so V, hold on a second. V, would you give us an example of what you think a conflict between two disciplines might be?
Sure.
Just anything. It doesn't have to be V.
Are you asking me or the group?
No, V, because didn't you just answer the question?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So for mine, and I'm not sure how strong this is, I was looking at conflict of what causes. Mine was focused on maternal mortality.
Okay.
And based on the disciplines, they tend to have different explanation of what they think the causes are.
Right. Okay. That's a good enough example. So there might be one way that different disciplines conflict in the way that they contribute to a problem. It might be they have a different, as we said, a different viewpoint of what the cause of a problem is. They might have a different lens in which they look at a problem. So for instance, a problem could be a social problem. It could be an economic problem. It could be an individual problem, like a psychological problem. And so, Michelle, back to your presentation. So what the authors are talking about is these sorts of conflicts between disciplines that might be included in the problem that you've provided, right? And as a researcher, how do you first identify those conflicts and then ultimately possibly figure out how those conflicts actually draw you to something that you didn't notice before? So let me give you an example. So if you, in the literature, you said you found a lot in biomedicine and it looked at it different ways, and you were hoping you would find something in, I think you said social science or ethics or something like that, okay? Well, if there's a disconnect, there's a conflict, or there's no overlap, let's think of it that way, between biomedicine and ethics. You've looked at the biomedicine literature, you've looked at the ethics literature, and you realize, I feel somehow my problem, these should connect somehow, but they don't, okay? That's a gap, we call it, in research. That means somebody hasn't asked this question or hasn't looked at a problem where these two connect, all right? And you're going to hear me talk a lot about this. When you're looking to do your own research, you're looking for those places where things don't connect, because that's where you need to do the research, all right? My metaphor is a block of Swiss cheese. You're looking for the holes, not the cheese.
Right.
So this process that the authors walk you through sort of help you say, okay, this problem that I've identified, how would social science look at it? Let's say sociology. How would ethics look at it? How would et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And then you find, as someone stated already, Maheen said, what are your most relevant ones? Okay, and you whittle it down a little bit. Then you find where the conflicts are and where you might be able to bring those conflicts together. Because bringing the conflicts together is part of the cross-disciplinary part. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to say anything about that? You look like you had a point.
Yeah, I have some questions.
Sure.
So in the biomedical discipline, I see that the publications are all focused on a specific disease, and they don't present engagement from a perspective of this method. I mean, and I think of it from a research perspective of how would you do a particular method? This method is better than that method, or we're going to compare this way of engaging versus that way of engaging, and really see that this one had a difference in. There was nothing in that. I found nothing about that. I think that's not cross-disciplinary, though.
Right.
Is that correct?
So what you're saying is when you looked at the biomedical literature, you didn't see comparisons in the way that medicine looks at this problem, right? Is that what you're saying?
Right. For example, right.
Okay.
If you were looking at for a cancer trial, and you were saying if we were to do focus groups as a way of engagement versus surveys as a way of engagement, which way of getting feedback would result in this trial recruiting faster? There was nothing in the literature that showed method A versus method B of engagement, or engagement A
what are
versus
the?
engagement B. That to me,
Go ahead. I'm sorry, we have a delay. Go ahead.
is that is not cross-disciplinary then?
Well, actually, that's part of what you're trying to figure out. So you ask yourself the question more broadly: how does biomedicine understand a problem like this? Not the exact method per se, because it's possible even people in biomedicine use surveys and they use focus groups and they use all kinds of things. Okay, really, it's more about the ethos of the discipline. So it's just in general, how does biomedicine look at this particular problem? Just generally speaking. Michelle?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm taking notes.
That's okay. That's okay. How does biomedicine, in your mind, look at this particular problem?
They look at it from a very scientific perspective, and almost in what I saw as a retrospective review of what they did.
No. That's methods. That's methods. So let's look. You answer the question. I'm a biomedicine person, and I look at the problem this way. Don't worry about methods. Worry about how you would look. Would you look at it from an emotional standpoint?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Would you look at it from a chemical standpoint? How would you look at it?
Quantitative way.
Okay, that's a method again. So what are you studying? Like, what are you studying? Not how are you studying it? What are you studying when you're in biomedicine? What are you interested in?
Biology, medicine.
Okay.
Physiology.
Okay. Can you imagine that my answer would be very different if my discipline was psychology?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the next question is, what are the conflicts between psychology, and let's just stick with biology at the moment, okay? Psychology is not about anatomy. It's not about circulation. It's not about, per se, okay? But biology is. What is psychology about?
So it's a way how one thinks.
How one thinks, emotions.
Behavior.
Exactly, right. Those are, for all practical purposes, conflicts in the way that those two disciplines look at the same thing. But can you imagine how those two things could be used together to address the problem that you brought up?
Yes. However, I think it makes me think, why is biomedicine at all involved in this? Because to me, it's not a biomedical question.
Okay, but what you're doing, you're sorting out the possibilities. You're sorting out the possibilities of new ideas when you say something like that. The question was, how can biomedicine and psychology address this problem that you've brought up? Imagine how together those could. Is there a psychological aspect to this?
Absolutely. I think there's way more of a psychological aspect to it than a biomedical.
Okay.
It's about inquiring about perceptions and getting inputs from patients and attitudes about researchers as to why they may or may not want to involve patients.
Okay. So what you learned from the little bit of literature review you did, right, about biomedicine, what would be the bridge between how biomedicine is looking at it and how psychology could look at it? What would be the connection? Because those were your TBD, right? Where does it connect? How do you see it could connect?
I see that from a psychology perspective, that understanding people's attitudes or behaviors or the way they think about the value and the way they measure value is going to be different from the way someone else might measure value. And their approach will be different. I think from a biomedical perspective, a researcher may not think about value in the same way because they're looking at the disease condition, and perhaps input isn't going to affect the pathophysiology of a disease.
Nice explanation. There's an opportunity to address a problem using two disciplines to your point, enhance what research has already been done with it. So that would be, it's just two disciplines, okay? But that would still be a cross-disciplinary perspective. And you could put together research questions using those two perspectives that would answer questions that you have not yet found, at least so far, in the literature you looked at, which was very heavily biomed. We could play the same game all night long, and I could say, what about economics? Is there an economic side to this? I could say, what about ethics? Is there an ethics side to this? And when you're thinking, and this is really for everybody, when you're thinking about doing cross-disciplinary work, what you're trying to do is say, if I put all these things together, where are the holes in the research in this subject? To find those holes, you might very well need to create a way of looking at it that isn't just biomed, not just psychology, not just economics, not just ethics, whatever, but all of them looking at it together. You're in a course on complexity science, right? Well, you have to look at things from a lot of different perspectives. It's almost three-dimensional. That's why cross-disciplinary work would assist in that process. But if there's a takeaway here, because as the night goes on, I get to grab a little bit from each of you to sort of make a point. The point here, to take away here would be careful, and many of you are clinicians, this is normal. Stakeholder diversity and disciplinary diversity are two different things, okay? Because when you put a nurse, a PA, a physician, a physical therapist together, they're really pretty close in the way that they look at problems compared to biology, psychology, economics, and ethics. They absolutely look at things totally differently, those disciplines. What we're looking for are those bodies of science, not those professions, but the bodies of science that actually address some of the problems that you're bringing up, okay? Okay, we need to move on. And this is part of this game, and I'm sorry about it because we just have to keep moving. Nice job, Michelle. Who's next? I forget.
Me.
Me. Hi, me. As long as you know who you are. All right.
Okay.
You should be able to pull up your slides. Okay, whenever you're ready. Genetic testing.
Okay. All right, hopefully you guys can see that. Okay, so my presentation is on genetic testing in minorities. So genetic testing is a useful tool in prevention, early detection, and successful treatment of a lot of diseases. It's most often used in cancer, and that's what I personally focus on, especially when we are looking at personalized medicine and tailored treatments. So
excuse me, Michelle. Excuse me, Maheen.
Yeah.
You might want to flip your screen. If you
we
go
have the
into
presenter
display
mode.
settings, yeah, then we will see it in a presenter mode. Now we can see your notes as well. So
okay.
It's not a huge problem, but if you want to do that, that's great.
Thank you.
Is this any different? No, this is still. Is that any different?
Well,
I mean, it doesn't matter. You can present it either way.
Yeah.
I mean, I can read it. It's fine.
You can continue doing what you're doing. It's fine.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. So genetic testing is used primarily by non-Hispanic whites. Only about 25% or less than that, 25% of genetic testing users are members of racial or ethnic minorities. And individuals from these minority groups are less likely to undergo genetic testing for a variety of reasons. Some of them are costs, insurance coverage, medical mistrust, and societal and religious beliefs. So a cross-disciplinary approach makes sense here because there are lots of disciplines involved in the topic and none of them have been able to fully explain or resolve the issue. Disciplines have made suggestions on facilitators, but there's very limited data about actually implementing and testing the effectiveness of these initiatives. And secondly, people who are not non-Hispanic whites make up about 25% of the US population. So this is an unresolved societal issue that affects about a quarter of the country. So there are a lot of stakeholders involved in the issue. Some of them are obvious, genetics, oncology, epidemiology. I think psychology plays a role because the way that you think obviously is going to impact whether or not you decide to pursue testing. I put anthropology on my list because I think that culture plays a huge role on our decision making. And a major barrier to genetic testing is insurance coverage. So public policy and political science do play a role here. I chose genetics, oncology, and public health as my most relevant disciplines because these are the originating disciplines that I saw the most often in my literature search. So for these disciplines, the topic is a natural focus and they've developed research and theories about it. So these are the databases that I used. CINAHL was the most useful, but Scopus, Medline, and PubMed also had some good resources, and I included some of my favorites here. And I limited my search to publications from the US within the past 10 years. So the major issue I had during my literature search was actually surrounding the wording that some authors had used. So some authors used underserved populations rather than minority groups, but then other authors considered underserved populations to be people like prisoners, minors, people in rural communities. So it was a little bit difficult to find exactly what I was looking for. And there's always the fear that I might miss key articles just because of the way that I've worded the question or my search terms. And so to take the preliminary literature review full scale, I would like to identify initiatives that have been implemented and what the results of those were. So far, I've only seen one article that specifically talked about an initiative that provided people of minority groups with free genetic testing. And it was found to be very useful, but it was the only article that I could find that was specifically on an initiative. And secondly, I think it would be really useful and really important to find the reasons behind the reasons. So we know that, we know what a lot of the barriers are. We know that genetic testing referral rates are low in minority groups, but have we looked at why they're low? Why aren't clinicians, giving these referrals? Why is medical mistrust higher in minority groups than in non-Hispanic whites? So just, diving a little bit deeper into not just that the barriers exist, but why they exist. So adequacy, being able to understand each discipline's perspectives and, their concepts, assumptions, theories about the topic. I feel like I really learned how to narrow down the goal of the research project and focus on exactly what the question is, focusing on the idea that we want to create a more comprehensive understanding than was previously available. And I was also able to practice, seeing things from each discipline's perspectives, kind of identifying what each discipline's concerns and priorities were. Something I would like to improve on in the future is identifying the most relevant disciplines, because I feel like that plays a huge role on your results. I feel like the ones that I chose were very similar to each other, especially genetics and oncology, because they go hand in hand. And I would have liked to incorporate maybe public policy or anthropology or something, but these were just the disciplines that had the most research available. So those are the ones that I went with. So here I just put a table that focuses on each discipline's perspectives and their priorities. So in genetics, we're focusing on the problem that decreased genetic testing can result in undiagnosed and untreated genetic disorders, and then also unknowingly passing on gene mutations. And this has a negative impact, not just on the gene pool, but also on genetics research as a whole. Because if all of the data that we have is just on non-Hispanic whites, it's not generalizable to everybody. So it's, it's not that it's useless, but it's not useful to everybody. And so genetic testing in oncology is mostly about tumor profiling, testing hereditary cancer syndromes like breast cancer, colon cancer. And the priority here is precision medicine and early detections so that we can, find the best course of treatment. And so the focus here is really on the best prognosis for each individual patient. Public health kind of focuses on the less hard scientific side of it. So the big question here is about which initiatives we can implement to educate the public about genetic testing and its benefits, and how we can encourage or facilitate uptake of testing. So this discipline kind of focuses on factors like household income, education level, socioeconomic status. So every discipline has a slightly different perspective on the problem, and they have different priorities. So some conflicts did arise between insights. Some authors said socioeconomic status is a barrier. Some authors said that people are interested in testing regardless of, household income, regardless of cost. And some disciplines focus on health literacy, some focus on the fact that minority groups avoid seeking medical attention. And then, disciplines like public health focus on cost and socioeconomic status. But I think creating common ground between all these disciplines is kind of focusing on their common goal, that the uptake of genetic testing is low in minority groups, and it's something that we need to, do something about. So a comprehensive understanding would be that the barriers to genetic testing in these groups exist due to economic concerns, healthcare system effects, societal and cultural factors, and individual aspects as well. And healthcare professionals need to establish strategies to address the issue. And then we could communicate this understanding in a variety of ways. We could use a model, so written work that will guide others, maybe a model for increasing genetic testing in these groups that integrates some of our stakeholders, genetics, oncology, public health, public policy. We could use a new process to achieve new outcomes, which is all about making this understanding readily available to practitioners. So we could do a framework that outlines the new knowledge and steps that can be taken to kind of remedy. or we can critique an existing policy or propose a new policy. And here we can focus on something related to health insurance, because a lot of these individuals are on Medicaid or Medicare. So we can kind of propose a policy that includes coverage or minimal out-of-pocket costs. So the sources of these conflicts, I think, may arise from the way that data is collected and analyzed. So some sources use quantitative data, so they retrospectively analyze patient data, or they use questionnaires that had some sort of method of quantifying the data. Other researchers used, qualitative data, so focus groups. So I think that the method of data collection that you use is going to play a huge role on the types of results that you get, and therefore the conclusions that you form using your results. And then the audience who may be interested here, minority groups, so they can learn about how this research affects them and how they can benefit from it. Physicians can gain awareness about the issue and learn how to address it. Researchers can learn about recruitment strategies, and industry stakeholders can kind of identify their target demographics. And then just another underlying assumption here is that compared to non-Hispanic whites, individuals in racial or ethnic minority groups tend to have lower education levels, lower socioeconomic status, and less interest in seeking medical care. So again, here I just discussed the assumptions that minority groups are thought to be less interested in medical care, less interested in undergoing testing, and just have a limited understanding of genetics and genetic testing. So I think that we should modify this assumption and instead assume that everyone, regardless of their demographic data, has the same level of interest in medical care and in genetic testing, as long as they're provided with adequate knowledge on the topic. And then this slide just goes deeper into like a more comprehensive understanding of the barriers and the proposed facilitators from my literature review. So I took those and I kind of grouped them into the 4 categories that I mentioned earlier. So we have economic concerns, healthcare system effects, societal and cultural factors, and then just individual aspects. And then just to reflect on the more comprehensive understanding, I think the choice, again, of the most relevant disciplines plays a huge role, because, the ones that you choose are going to shape, your literature review and therefore your results. So had I chosen different ones, I think my end result would have been a lot different. And then to test the comprehensive understanding, I thought Newell's test was the most appropriate. So does the understanding allow for more effective action? Does it help solve the problem? And is it useful to practitioners, the public, policymakers? And I think it's yes for all of those. And then here I just have my references.
Would you, Mahid, would you keep your slides up? I just might want to reference back to something.
Yes.
Does anyone want to start with some comments? Very nice presentation. Thank you. Thank you. Any thoughts?
Maheen, I had one comment. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Maheen, I had one comment. I really liked the way in one of your slides, how you tabularized your thinking there. I'm actually going to borrow that concept. That is really well organized, and it helps you parse the information across disciplines in terms of understanding how each discipline contributes. So I thought that was a really well done job.
Great, thank you.
I think you did a great job, and really there's this chart where you split up the different perspectives and their perspectives and how they see the issue. Yeah. I may not have associated that perspective to a particular discipline, but it speaks for itself as what the discipline is seeing in its perspective. So I too will be borrowing that.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
So it's always good to identify what the assumptions of a discipline are. In this case, what you've done is you sort of gone as far as to say, what do these disciplines say about the problem, but go even one step before that. So what's the assumption, for instance, of public health? That education, socioeconomics, geography, etc., all have something to do with genetic testing. That is a very different assumption than that genetic testing is completely related to assessing cancer risk and to providing treatment. Okay, these are totally different ways of looking. Their assumptions are basically different. Okay, now where you could expand on that is if genetics and public health both mention or assume that literacy, one is health literacy, the other is education, somehow is coupled with ethnicity and socioeconomic status. What other column could you add to this that would contribute to understanding this problem better? Literacy, education.
So determinants, are you saying determinants,
No,
Professor?
Discipline.
Okay.
Education. That's what I was thinking. So for instance, there's a couple things involved here that make the assumption that education and health are related.
Right.
Okay. Education does not look at economic, socioeconomic, and status in the same way. Education may look at the differences in the way culture or ethnicity plays in the way people learn. Okay, so when we say something like health literacy or better health illiteracy, okay, we often frame that against whose health system? Western health system, right? We often don't think, well, are they illiterate in their cultural health system? That's a different way. Education would account for that. So I'm only throwing that out there because we're on this subject. I want to go back to something that I think plays a part in what we're talking about here, and that's the issue of vocabulary. So imagine for yourself, if you're a researcher and you're working with different disciplines and they call the same things by different names or different words. Is your job to sort of homogenize them or to respect the differences in the terminology? What's your gut response?
Respect the differences.
Yeah, because if you respect the differences, you're going to realize, to the problem you stated, that when I look to different disciplines and I use their language, I'm more likely to find what I'm looking for. So if you look at, if you use the term underrepresentation, okay, not every discipline uses that term that way. You know, some may use, maybe economics wouldn't call it underrepresentation. Maybe they would call it low income or something else. Now, that becomes a seeming headache, but it's all part of this idea of adequacy. Adequacy is not knowing everything about everything. It's knowing partially what you don't know and knowing enough to say, I bet you the education literature would help me with this. Or I bet you the economics literature would help me with this. Instead of just sitting there going, oh my goodness, everyone's talking about education in a different way. What am I going to do about it? Well, adequacy says maybe I should look to the education literature and get some insight. It's like you guys are much younger than I am. It's like knowing which encyclopedia to pull out. It's like, well, do I pull out volume 3 or volume 5 or volume 17? You don't have to have the entire and all the encyclopedias memorized. You just need to know where to go. And that's this idea of adequacy. Also, one other thing that was interesting in both the first two presentations, when you look to the literature, do you look for the literature to confirm your problem or to adjust your problem?
Well, wouldn't you start with actually first looking if anything has been done from that discipline's perspective, and then you're going those next steps of confirming what has been done and looking at the different perspectives and then seeking alignment to find that common ground. Would that be the pathway?
So you're all researchers.
Yeah.
You're PhD students. You're going to be researchers, right? Are you looking to answers before you do any research? Are you looking for the research that hasn't been done yet?
Yeah, so usually I would first look up to see if anyone has done the problem yet. And if someone has done it, then, you know, there's work done. But if I look up the problem and I don't find anything, bingo, that's the problem. And so then I would proceed on going on with finding the other issues.
That's working in the right direction. So a problem is something that usually is quite large, that you can't just solve, you know, in one sitting or one study, right? So the problem here is, let's just say it's genetics and health literacy, right? Genetics and health literacy is this giant monster-sized problem, okay? What you're looking for is what about that problem hasn't been asked yet. Think of it that way. So, Maheen, what about this problem have you found no one's asked anything about, or you're just having trouble finding it? Not what you found that confirmed your problem, but what didn't you find that people are asking about this problem?
So I think what I'm looking for is which strategies are helpful in increasing uptake of genetic testing. And that's something that I'm not seeing that question asked anywhere. So I know, you know, why is it a problem has been asked. What can we do has been asked, but successful has not. I could not find that asked anywhere.
Okay, good. So we would call that a research question.
Okay.
You have a problem, and that's your research question. And then this whole process you're going through for everybody is to say what disciplines have the approach that is going to help me answer that research question.
Okay.
Okay, that's different than looking at all the different disciplines and constructing the problem.
Okay.
Okay, so let me put this in very gross terms. World hunger is a problem, right? It's this giant problem, okay? World peace is a giant problem. You can't do one study and solve that problem. You can do a study that's going to contribute to some portion of that problem, okay? We usually call those your research questions. So what you just described to me, you ask yourself, okay, of all these disciplines I came across, what are the ones that are going to most likely help me construct a way to research that part that nobody's researched yet? That's what you're all doing in this activity. I mean, this is just an activity. You're not doing a research project. It's just an activity. How do I maneuver between, and let's just use this slide, genetics, oncology, and public health which all have really something good to contribute to what I'm trying to figure out, but sometimes they don't agree, or sometimes they assume different things, or sometimes they use different language. That's a cross-disciplinary design. How do you use that diversity in disciplinary approach to shed light on something that hasn't been asked already? Does that make sense?
I have a question though, Dr. L,
Sure.
on that regard. So this is fantastic. It's kind of like, I really your analogy of that Swiss cheese with holes is something that will stay with me. So the question here is, then we are steering away from, and this is my concern, and tell me if I'm not thinking correctly here, steering away from interdisciplinarity to transdisciplinarity, because what we are doing is we are picking 2 or 3 disciplines and saying, oh, I'm going to take a research problem that's got to be narrower in scope, so I'm going to make this a problem of the disciplines I want to study. Now, isn't that somewhat counter to the interdisciplinary approach?
No, I would bump it back. I agree with you, but I would say you're going from multi to inter, not inter to trans. So multi is you take genetics for what genetics is, you take oncology for what it is, you take public health for what it is, right? That's multi.
Yes.
None of it, that's multi. Cross-disciplinary, which is the genetic term. I mean, the generic term. Interdisciplinarity would be how do those impact each other? That's interdisciplinarity. So what happens when we do genetic testing on cancer through a lens of health literacy?
Okay.
See how that brings them together?
Yeah, and one of the things that I have been doing, this is some of my old habits, I guess, being in strategy and strategic planning. I was thinking about how do you take the problem, in its entirety and look for solutions that will help solve, like you pointed out, for example, for world hunger. Yep. But then, from a PhD scholar standpoint about a specific problem that I would like to solve, I have to kind of move away from that aspect of thinking to, more of a, and I'll talk about my presentation in a few minutes here. If I want to go across biology and anthropology, for example,
right,
how do those two disciplines can feed each other?
Yeah. So think about a problem like getting to Mars. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Okay. How do we crack that one? How do we get to Mars? And you know how many studies and disciplines and so forth go into trying to figure that out? A multitude of studies, right? And many of them are cross-disciplinary. In fact, space and astrophysics and so forth are like one of the greatest examples of how things need to be cross-disciplinary, because we have the physics of going into space. We have compounds and metals, and we have astronomy, we have fabrics, we have you name it, right? All these come together. So the problem is at a higher level. The research question is at a measurable level. So if we ask a research question, we should be able to solve it if we incorporate the right methods, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
gotcha.
Think of the problem as bigger and think of your research questions as smaller.
Yeah.
And they're sort of like little chips. You're chipping away at a big boulder with a hammer, they're much smaller. But I think, again, if I wanted to bring a takeaway here, I think you did a really nice job with this presentation. This gets closer to the idea of trying to understand how do the differences in the disciplines actually bring a new insight to the problem.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, and it
It's more
actually
novel. It's more novel. Think of it that way.
I
it
started
opens up a
talking
lot
about
of doors for thinking about specific problems that you could be addressing
That's
based
right.
on learning the bigger picture. That's great. Thank you.
Right. Okay, so we have to keep moving. I'm sorry. Who is next?
Okay.
Kalyan, are you next?
Yes.
Okay, good.
So
Thank
let
you.
me share my screen here.
Mahin, thank you.
So as he brings up his slides, I was just wondering what exactly would Mahin do to make her slides better?
Well, I think your slides were fine.
Oh,
I would say, I
Okay.
would say, you know, I think there's more. You admitted yourself that when you were looking at oncology and genetic testing and so forth, you were actually looking at things that were pretty similar. You know, you admitted that yourself, right? So I would say think about the problem that you stated and think of a more creative question that would you can imagine including more perspectives too. So, you know, you're in complexity science and you're starting to realize that the world is this very unstable, chaotic place, right? And that, you know, it's unlikely that any one test or any one study or any one way of looking at the world is going to solve really difficult problems. You need to get into the habit of understanding I might need to look at something from multiple lenses. When you look at things through multiple lenses, and this was even with the pool material, when you look at conflict and gender and functionality, for instance, all at the same time, that conjures up some really interesting questions to ask, much more interesting than if you only looked at something from a functional perspective. The same thing goes here. Like maybe, and I'm not saying there was anything wrong with what you said was missing from the literature, but when you reflect on, oh yeah, maybe education will enlighten me a little bit too. Maybe poverty studies, for instance, might enlighten me a little more. What you find yourself doing is what I always say is improvement is asking better questions, not coming up with better answers per se. When you do cross-disciplinary work, you're actually asking better questions because you're trying to include more of the way that we look at the world in the work that you're doing.
Thanks, that was very helpful.
You know, okay. Okay, already.
Can you
Kalyan,
see
all
my
yours.
presentation?
I can everyone.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to be talking about antimicrobial resistance and interdisciplinary research pertaining to AMR, which is the acronym I'll use throughout the presentation. So, why antimicrobial resistance? So antimicrobial resistance typically occurs when bacteria or other microorganisms that impact our health no longer respond to the medications that we take. And then it causes those resistant organisms to spread disease and cause severe illness or death. And it is a major global public threat and affects humans, animals, our environmental health, but also it affects our economies, as has been studied by some economists. And WHO has declared that AMR is one of the top 10 global public threats. And then, it's each year about 700,000 people die because of AMR. And in the US alone, 2.8 million people are infected and 35,000 people die as a result of AMR. So my mouse is so sensitive, so I have to really, okay. So the justification for cross-disciplinary approach here is because most of the understanding to date for AMR has been through biomedical perspectives. And AMR is looked upon as an antibiotic resistance problem. So Most of it has been addressed by implementing antimicrobial stewardship programs where they try to make the healthcare providers who are prescribing antimicrobials to be using them more judiciously and cautiously and more appropriately, which is one of the reasons why the AMR is caused. However, the problem is not just about prescription of antibiotics. It's much more broader than that. It is antibiotic use in animals, in farming, agriculture, and then across the world, we have medical supply chains that are not necessarily regulated. So people have free access to medicines. Then people move from one place to the other. So there is travel, migration, trade, and then economic and social demographies of different countries where practices are different because of the existing circumstances or cultural demographics there. So it is definitely a multi-disciplinary issue, and World Health Assembly resolution has mandated that we take a One Health approach where humans, animals, and the environment are considered into the approach for addressing AMR at the global level. So when I did the literature search, I looked at all the potential disciplines and the angles that I would like to take. And following your instructions, actually, Dr. L, what I did is I did not list all the disciplines here. I took all the disciplines and actually made the short list here of things that at least I want to consider for the sake of this academic learning. So I have biology, where your relevance is how do microbes develop resistance, the mechanisms, and ecology. Then you have the interaction between the environment, people, and animals, and how do resistant bacteria develop because of those interactions, and how do resistant bacteria impact those interactions as well. And then anthropology, which is the cultural element, of how people live their lives, and what are the cultural factors that are contributing to development of AMR. And then political science, which actually takes into account the policymakers, what are they doing and how do they interact. So one key thing to note here is, because this is a global problem, it cannot be solved by any one country. We have to all work together. So to make it a global problem, political science is, of course, a very relevant discipline. And then psychology, where some significant insights can be obtained into why AMR happens through the behaviors of people, but also, we talk about zoonotic diseases. So how do people interact with animals? That is another important element that is also going to drive that. And then farmers, agriculturists, how they are, what behaviors are being promoted there to cause this. And sociology, looking at, what are the facilitators and barriers, especially for communication, coordination. As you very well pointed out in another presentation, I thought about this, but did not include it here, but education is another important component. And sociology brings in education along with it, if I may. And finally, economics. So understanding, so this economics is an important connection to political science, because understanding the economic impact of what is happening both at the local, regional, national, and global level is going to be important in being able to craft policies. And economic impact also has a bearing on understanding, what are some of the circumstances people are living in that might be causing the problem as well. So for my literature review, when I started scratching the surface on this one, clearly there is a lot of literature out there, and much of that literature is focused on biology, because people are interested in learning about how are the organisms developing resistance, what are the antibiotics that are causing resistance, and how do those resistances look like in terms of demographics across the world. But if you subtract all that, when you look at social science research, one of the things that has happened in this area is it has been a while, even 15 years ago, people started looking at the economic impact. But 15 years ago, people started looking at it also as an interdisciplinary approach, but people haven't done much. Once again, when they start talking about interdisciplinary approach, they have focused on biology, medicine, and focusing on antibiotic use. So there is a significant gap there in terms of interdisciplinarity being able to contribute. That said, in the last 3-4 years, there has been a significant progress made towards interdisciplinarity in this field. So I looked at literature and pulled out examples of, articles that are available there, the publications, and tried to find from the publications, did a little bit of a discipline and stakeholder mapping, and what are some of the key challenges associated with each discipline. So for example, if you went here, challenges for biology are resistance mechanisms are understood. But really, when you're crafting policy, it goes as far as helping a physician understand why this is happening. But in terms of antibiotic use itself, maybe that information is relevant only to a certain extent. But whereas if you look at the psychology aspect, which I'll go to the next page, psychology aspect here, you have, there is really an important behavior change aspect that we need to think about. And that is actually a gap. Although some research has been done, there hasn't been much research in terms of why do prescribers prescribe the way they do? Why do patients go and ask for antibiotics? What are the circumstances? How do antibiotics get accessed? In some places in the world, you can just go to the pharmacist and request for an antibiotic and you'll get one. So these factors all contribute to AMR at a global level. And then finally, sociology, I already touched on it, and economics, that's the big picture, crafting the policy aspect that economics is going to significantly help. But it's also going to help address the problem from another angle, which is, circumstances that people live in where you have to go and impact those circumstances as well. Economics has an important aspect to provide understanding about that. So there is multiple problems here which can be solved using a combination of any of these disciplines. There are other disciplines that I reflected on, and when it comes, being of an engineering background, my proclivity is to usually ask about the sciences that could be contributing here. Artificial intelligence is one of the areas, and in literature, I was very curious when I found some articles about game theory and their application of game theory into addressing antimicrobial resistance. Some fascinating research out there in pockets, but that's not comprehensive. So my question was, and actually this is going away from what you were asking, and maybe this is not a good question for this reflection here, which is, okay, to solve the problem at a global level, how are we bringing all this research together? Maybe that's an implementation science issue, but then at the same time though, can it be handled? Can we address it just like you pointed out, similar to the world hunger level? So I'll leave it at that for now as a reflection. So for adequacy skills, again, I followed some of the concepts that were provided to us. And across disciplines, in the interdisciplinary approaches, one key problem is making anti-disciplinary approaches for antibiotic stewardship programs. So this is where the prescription of antibiotics comes into picture, but it has only been addressed from the biology angle. So how do we make it from a psychology and anthropology angle to help physicians, pharmacists, as well as pharmaceutical supply chains to be able to address that problem? Ecology and biology. Again, I talked about the synergistic relation between people, animals, and environment, and how the environment affects the people and animals impact the environment. So that needs to be studied in a broader way using both biology and ecology. And then for the policy making that I've already touched on before. So in terms of the conflicts, so when it comes to psychology, when you're looking at an angle and at a problem from the angle of behaviors and what behaviors are causing things to happen, and this is where I was trying to separate the problem out earlier a little bit, but then if you bring biology, why do the resistances develop in the first place? What mechanisms are causing that? And how our behaviors are impacting those mechanisms? That is interdisciplinary there, and that has a lot of opportunity. And in those cases, the conflict would be biology would come from the angle of explaining the mechanisms, but not necessarily solving the problem of why people are doing what they do. And then psychology needs to take into account how the behaviors are impacting those mechanisms. So it could be a interdisciplinary addressing. So I have listed out a few others here in terms of integrative approach between sociology, economics, biology, and ecology. Again, though, one of the lenses I was wearing, which I'm going to like now go forward as an improvement, is taking the lens as a broader problem solution lens versus looking for interdisciplinary research opportunities. So this is an important lesson learned through the reflection. So again, I talked about this to a certain extent already, the sources of conflict. I wanted to organize my thoughts here. And as you can see here, I've mentioned some of the areas where the sources of conflicts could be coming into picture. And so going into finding that common ground. So utilizing all of the 6 concepts that were presented in the book, the technique of redefinition, the technique of extension, this is a ripe area for that. So for example, the technique of extension, again, going back to the example of the biology and psychology, there the technique of extension can be very valuable in terms of redefining those interdisciplinary perspectives to be able to solve the problem. So this is where you're attempting some changes. But what are the ingredients that need to come together for that? There's the education component that we all know, but education means that it is founded in both biology as well as economics, and then a certain degree on sociology, because you have to take into account the and anthropology as well, because you have to take into account the cultural context in which people are doing what they're doing to be able to help them get past that. And also the living conditions are an important aspect to that, and that's where economics comes into picture. Okay. And similarly, I went into technique of organization. This is where stakeholders come into picture. But then again, bringing those stakeholder perspectives into the interdisciplinary range will then help us organize why the pollination across the disciplines should be from a broader perspective. But at the same time, you're trying to align the concepts there. And ethical positions, in this case, the most important part of the ethical position would be, really helping people understand, what I'm doing is not just impacting me, but it could impact the entire world. And it could have a significant impact on that. But then again, you have to do that from a cultural and social context as well, because you have to take into account why people are doing what they're doing. It's most of the time it is because of the circumstances that they're living in that we need to account for through the sociology studies and economic studies. And then here is one place where the creating common ground between insights that have a theoretical base. I was letting myself a little bit loose here because I really like system dynamics, thinking about angles of complex adaptive systems here. So how does this problem, if you want to think really broad and you want to create a model taking into account several of these aspects, for a bigger solution of the problem, there is opportunity here. So although there is a limited amount of literature on system dynamic applications to antimicrobial resistance, again, this would be something that I'd be interested in to look at it a little bit more in detail. So my comprehensive understanding of the problem, as indicated in chapter 12, is, most of the research, and sorry, I misstated here, disciplinary or transdisciplinary, because I was thinking transdisciplinary as 1 or 2 disciplines, and I'll change that to multidisciplinary. But to make this a problem that can be solved at the international level, there is a lot of collaboration that is needed between disciplines, and we need to chip away at the problem, as you pointed out. And I look forward to finding that chip for myself to be able to solve the problem. And then I did these. I dared to do the stack test in the end here, and that comes again, this talking about full range of causal relationships. That goes back to the system dynamics aspect that I talked about. So there is opportunity there, and it needs to be contextualized in the interdisciplinary approach. But then most importantly, the key stakeholders we need to influence through this is the policymakers.
Right.
So
nice.
So that's
Very
the end of
nice.
my presentation.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you to go back to that slide where you had the questions that each discipline asks? It's kind of like in the first third, if I recall. This is a really, I would highly recommend this sort of, no, keep going back, where you have the different, that's it, that's one. So this is a really great way of trying to figure out what's the difference in what a discipline is asking. Like, you know, what does a discipline look for? And I really like this table, and I've seen other people work this sort of table, especially when people say the social sciences. Well, social sciences are a huge collection of disciplines, and they actually ask different questions. So here, what you did, Kalyan, is the difference between anthropology is different than psychology. It asks different questions that sociology asks and economics, although they're all social sciences, right? And I think this is a good way sometimes to organize. You know, there's relevant disciplines, but you need to think the way they do. What are they asking? So you put in biology, how do microbes develop resistance? That's what biology is asking, because that's the lens of biology. It wants to know the microbes, how do they do their thing? Okay, that's what biology does, right? Ecology, however, is asking a slightly different question that is couched in an environmental context. How do resistant microbes originate from environmental bacteria? That's a different question. And it's actually driven by the disciplinary assumption. Does everyone see that? It's the same thing like, for instance, anthropology. How do different stakeholders contribute to the use of antimicrobials? It's how do people do things? You know, how does a culture do it? What are the challenges for optimal use of antimicrobials in a culture? You know, like what, you know, and by the way, these are just a couple questions. There could be 10 questions. But what it helps you do is get to the point of what is the discipline asking generally, excuse me, in light of the problem. Then if you could go forward just to those slides in the literature review, where you have that's good. That one's fine. So thank you. So then you could take it one step further, because this particular problem has an implementation dimension. So you can start to think about, well, who cares about this? Like, really, who cares? Like, who cares about the biological question? Who cares about the ecological question? Who cares about the anthropological question? Excuse me again. And that's where you can start to think about, if I were to do research, how would I either gather data about the research? Who would be the participant, the subject of the research? So for instance, in the anthropology, patients, prescribers, governments, global bodies, yes, they all contribute to a culture. And if I was to take an anthropological approach to this problem, that's probably where I would get data, right? On the biological side, I mean, I would probably get data from microbes, but the stakeholder representation helps you understand where you might collect data about the problem, or excuse me, data that's going to support your research question. Okay. So I really like the way you lay this out, because I think what you found by the end of this process is I could ask a lot of different questions, and the questions could be cross-disciplinary. They don't all have to be just through one of these disciplinary lenses. Does anyone have any thoughts about this presentation? Does it bring anything to light, or do you have any questions for Kalyan?
Is there
Overwhelming?
anything he would need to add to make his slides any better, as they are already very good?
Well, it's not, I think you did a very good job here. I'm not sure I would say what needs to be added. What I like about it is that you took an approach that very systematically looked at the disciplines on their own. Okay, by the way, I always have to make sure I say this to every group. No one is saying there's no place for disciplinary research. There absolutely is. But as translational health scientists, you're 9 times out of 10 going to be looking at much more complex situations that have to do with not only a discipline or a phase of research, but are looking across phases and across chasms. So you're going to be asking questions that are going to rely on more than one perspective 99% of the time. So I don't want you to take away from this that good old-fashioned biology on its own has no place. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is it's all dependent on the problem and the questions you're asking. You are probably, because translational science is a cross-disciplinary science, you're probably going to need to integrate across disciplines. Okay. I don't want to get the reputation for telling you that we no longer need anthropologists. We definitely need anthropologists, but translational scientists need anthropologists and political scientists and, you know, ecologists and biologists, because you're looking at systems of health problems, not just the biology of a microbe. That's not what translational scientists do. That's what bench scientists do. Translational scientists look at the system. So 9 times out of 10, 99% of the time, you're going to need to take a cross-disciplinary approach. Okay?
Yeah. Thank you
very
for
nice
that
presentation.
Insight.
Sure. Very
Thank
nice
you.
presentation. V, I think you're next, right? Veronica?
Yes,
Am I
I am
correct?
next.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
We're ready when you're
So
ready.
let me go ahead and share my desktop.
Oh, Dr. Lee must have taken off. Oh, there she is. She's sitting in her seat. She might not be able to hear us.
Can you guys see my
Not yet.
desk?
Did you push the green button that says share
Oh,
screen?
no. Yes.
When you push share screen, oh, there we go. There it is.
Do you see it? Okay.
Yep, you see it.
Let me go ahead. Okay. What view do you guys have? Okay.
We have the presentation view. Thank you.
All right.
We're good.
Okay. Thank you, Kalyan. So my research is focused on addressing gaps and implementing research findings into healthcare practices to lower maternal mortality in African American women in the US. So the problem that I work to identify, and I will be forthcoming, I have reiterated it a couple of times and still kind of teeter as I'm going through the review process to make sure that I'm showing something. I'm looking at a problem that's encompassing different areas in order to address the question. So just to give a brief background, the maternal mortality is defined as death during pregnancy, childbirth, or within 48 days of termination of pregnancy. Maternal morbidity, it refers to any health condition attributed or aggravated by pregnancy or childbirth that results in negative consequences to a woman's health. The reason why I included the definition of morbidity is because, as you'll find later on, one of the issues that I find is the use of the vocabulary between the two terminology. And initially I went back to add morbidity, but then changed it after a few of the reviews because I wanted to focus more on mortality. There is a high prevalence of maternal mortality in African-American women in the US compared to other races. And this is supported by the CDC's notation that African-American women experience a higher rate of maternal mortality with a pregnancy-related mortality ratio of 40.8 than other racial populations. So that's about 4 times than other racial population. And because of this, I wanted to examine the significant and notable gaps in implementing research findings into healthcare practices to lower maternal mortality in this specific group. So in terms of justification of a cross-disciplinary approach, it's important to understand that maternal mortality is a complex problem with underlying issues that stems from various disciplines, which must be considered in order to address the problem from a full scope. Maternal mortality impacts not only healthcare, but also socioeconomics, law policy, ethics, environmental, and cultural aspects. Oops. Sorry. I wanted to focus on relevant disciplines because, like I said, there are various areas in which maternal mortality affects. So the potential relevant disciplines I looked at includes demography, medicine, sociology, economics, public health, and population policy. The key disciplines I chose to focus on, and this is based on lit findings, was natural science, which include health science, specifically the healthcare for maternal and child health, and social sciences were significant in terms of sociology, which focus a lot on the racial inequities and racial disparities, and economics, which also looked at the economic inequality and economic burden. Data science was an area that showed that there was a lack of sufficient data and a lack of standardization of data, which attributes to this gap as well as political science, which looks at policies and programs that are either implemented or in process of attempting to implement them, and the efficacy. So part of my struggle with this and also with 8105 is the review and search. And this was discussed in the previous, in others' previous presentation. The terminology seems to have an impact depending on which database I'm looking into. So I did a couple of, I gave an example of the different search terms I have and the type of results that I pulled. As you can see in Psych Info, I was only able to pull about 10 sources that I found were relevant. And in PubMed, I was able to pull more just by changing around a few of the terminology. But as you could see, when I added more terms, it reduced it significantly. And in working with the librarian, initially I thought maybe I just wasn't doing it right. But she confirmed that in situations like these, they tend to highlight that there isn't enough information with where I am going. So I could most likely try to change it or stick to it. I chose to stick to it because this highlights an area of a gap, which is what my question focuses on. But oddly enough, in Google Scholar, for some reason, using the same exact terminology yielded a lot more results, but in reviewing the articles, Google didn't seem to bring up a search results with the terms as it's listed. So I would find some that would say mortality, but it would be infant mortality. But in reading the article, obviously with infant mortality, sometimes it's linked to maternal mortality. So I had to discover that I had to go into the article a little bit more. As I noted some of the challenges, just to reiterate, there were limited data pertaining to the issue for specific groups within the US. I did find that there were more information when I took off US and included global. And then in terms of the specific disciplines, there were not a lot of articles once I wanted to focus within the US and specifically with African Americans. Another issue that I found, or challenge that I found, was the lack of standardization in search terms used. As I mentioned, I found that there were times that mortality and morbidity was used either together or would use one versus the other, or it seemed like they were using some situations as synonym. However, I wanted to focus specifically on mortality, because then when you include morbidity, you're looking at like underlying disease, which could be genetic or can start from a time of pregnancy, or could even start after birth. Another area of challenge was narrowing the ethnic group terminology. So not only narrowing it down to African American was challenging, but also I had to look based on the database and based on the publication. They can vary in identifying as African American or Blacks or Black American. So a lot of my search had to include using one of those three as well. And then the other thing that I discovered in the search and also in discussing with the librarian is the term implementation. Because implementation is relatively new term, there weren't a lot of articles that specifically stated implementation. So I had to use other terms such as quality improvement or adoption, or something close to implement. Another one that I didn't include in the slide was cost effectiveness of a program. So the next steps I recommend is that I need to take is focusing on finding the common terms or mapping terms for the search, and looking for more articles in the different database specific to disciplines. And I may need to go back and modify my question based on our prior discussions with others in their presentation. So reflection of growth considered a lot of variations in the terminology that can be associated with the problem from the lens of the discipline. So that helped me significantly in trying to find the different viewpoints or the different lenses under each of the discipline. And then I also, one thing I did learn, didn't think about previously, was noticing a trend with authors who are considered experts in the field, and to use that to search for more literature related to my topic if I found that their article was more on point with the question. Another was being more inclusive with articles that refer to keywords such as infant mortality or morbidity under the title abstract, because even though it may not specifically state the keywords that I'm looking for, in reading the article and going through the review, I can find bits and pieces that addresses the question from a different perspective. And then also accepting the differences in keyword search in each database. And this was part of the vocabulary discussion that we had earlier. Areas that I felt that I need to continue to improve on includes accepting the perspectives of disciplines that are not of my own, and working, trying hard to avoid personal biases. For example, when we're looking at the socioeconomic, and the authors, a couple of the authors indicated that education plays a part, or economic status of the mother or the woman plays a part. I can see myself as I'm reading it say, no, that's not true. We have this case that happened and they have a lot of money. But so I just have to remember to take myself out of it, because there isn't a literature review to support that situation. Even though, let's say, it's like a popular known situation. And then also doubting or and expanding my problem statement. That's definitely an area that I need to improve on, but I do know that Repco noted that that's part of the process of the steps. So, but I just don't want to I don't want to overdo it for the fear of having to go back and then redo all the steps only to come back and do it again. Also recognizing theories between discipline, as noted in Repco and CILSAT. So I did my problem analysis by discipline, looking at health science. The perspective that I looked at was addressing the maternal mortality gap as a result of the predisposition in health and genetics. So this is more focused on the underlying biological issues. And then the sociology aspect looks at it from the articles I found focused on systemic and historical racism that affects each of the other disciplines. Economics aspect also addresses the gap as a result of the disparities in education, economic status, as well as the cost of healthcare and programs that are available to support these women. And then data science gap has shown the result of lack of known and standardized data related to maternal mortality across these disciplines. So different definitions for similar terms across the disciplines. And also law, which is more like political science, is what I should have had here, highlights areas of gaps in the policies that address or mitigate these issues, as well as going back to assess how effective these policies are. So I've provided key conflicts listed on the slide as causes of maternal mortality tend to differ based on the disciplines, as I highlighted previously. And then also the collection of data and standardization also plays a role, because the definition in terms of data collection can vary from one discipline to another. And for that reason, the information is not collected equally across the boards. And then also prevention and mitigation strategies as well are varying, as well as measuring the effects of the implemented programs. Common ground between the conflicts is the use of an interdisciplinary approach in addressing the issues. I found recommendation of workshops, which calls in different stakeholders to represent the different disciplines as they discuss standardization of data that they can use to collect, developing different a multidisciplinary approach to address the issue, and programs to use to assess the issue while considering the different disciplines. And I believe that viewing this as a complex issue is important, and for this reason is imperative that a cross-disciplinary approach should be used to address the problem, especially with one with such a high impact. So sources of conflicts I identified in the LIT review that I've done so far includes assumptions, and the type of assumptions I found includes epistemological assumptions, which includes knowledges that are obtained from research studies or epidemiology studies that the authors use to support their theories, as well as evaluating assumptions which includes theories that are related to racial disparities and also supported by population data in terms of social science. And then also concept of what quality improvement can decrease or reduce the causes of maternal morbidity, and also in terms of terminology and definitions. For example, what is the timeline for maternal morbidity? Though the definition specifically states 42 weeks, I've seen literature that cite up to a year or 2 years, because there are, as we are coming to find out, there are pre-existing conditions that can last longer, or conditions that are caused by pregnancy that couldn't last longer than 42 weeks. And then the audience of interest include, but are not limited to, African American women in this group, healthcare practitioners, policymakers, healthcare businesses. I listed insurance because there are a lot of disparities found in those who utilize Medicare or government subsidized insurance programs, as well as the community in general, because maternal mortality has a significant effect with the community, and it's as a complex health issue. There were notations where children whose mother died had a higher rate of dying, and that was definitely something that I did not consider, and thought was quite interesting in this aspect. So the common ground, I listed the 6 core ideas about creating the common ground between the conflict concept and the assumptions. One of my recommendations was using one of the 4 techniques, such as the redefinition, extension, transformation, and organization, to address the proposed conflict concept and assumptions. Fortunately, there are no ethical oppositions that I found on the LIT review so far, so I wanted to note that aspect. And then for problem and potential solutions, my overall statement is that there is an inherent need to close the gap in implementing the research findings into healthcare practices for the specific group. However, there's a strong significance in approaching this problem from various disciplines in order to address the issue. Common grounds in bridging the gaps includes establishing programs that address areas of improvement with considerations from each of the disciplines that are affected, standardization of data collection and monitoring processes, in addition to assessing the efficacy of implementation of the programs that are found during the research. And that is the end.
Great, thank you. Would you leave your slides up for a moment and go back? I want to make a comment about the idea of searching. You spent a lot of time talking about the process of your literature review, which I think you're doing for another class. I think you're doing for foundations, I think. So if you could go back to the slide where it showed your mesh, right there. So if you were going to look for literature which dealt with different disciplines that may or may not be typically utilized to look at a problem, like in this case, maternal mortality, what would be the disadvantage of using PubMed, PsycInfo, databases that are pretty much bound to medicine and health science?
Well, I'd find articles related only to medicine and health science.
What was that?
As opposed to other. I would find more articles related to medicine and health science as opposed to other disciplines.
Right, and I think one, and by the way, obviously you're health scientists, but I think sometimes you need to give a little thought to why something might not end up in that literature. Now, you would think, naturally, you would think if we're talking about maternal mortality, that is a health problem and it should be everywhere. If it's going to be found anywhere, it's going to be found in the health databases, the health and medical databases. But as you learned, that term, or at least that mesh of terms, didn't give you, at least initially, a really great response. And I think it's partially, like, and you stated this, it's partially because of the use of terms in different fields, even, you know, a less, you know, not a medical term, but a cultural term, like African American versus Black versus Blacks versus, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That in itself is enough variety of terminology to significantly affect your search success, you know, what you're going to find. So when you look down, and this is really for everybody, when you do use something like Google Scholar, obviously you're going to get a boatload of stuff from everywhere, including the gray literature, books, you name it, right? Well, that gives you the opposite problem, does it? Because you start looking and say, oh, this has nothing to do with what I'm looking for. But there is, to a degree, a helpful aspect to that, because what it will bring to light is how other fields deal with maternal mortality. Maybe you need to even change that term to mother's death, or death at childbirth, or, you know, other terms that are not these medical terms. It can help you sort of shape the way that different disciplines deal with this problem. So for instance, you're looking at it from maternal child and health perspective, right? But maybe there's a whole literature out there about mortality in a region, like, I don't know, Nigeria. Okay, well, maybe you don't even, you're not even aware of it, that, you know, in Nigeria, there is a particular issue regarding maternal death while giving birth. There is some there is some aspect of looking outside of the databases that you typically do for health information to gain access to the other disciplines' concerns. Maybe there's an economic concern. Maybe there is a concern about child rearing, nursing, midwifery, things that might not show up in the literature that you're looking for in the obvious places, but you need to look at the less obvious places. Okay, I think that's an important lesson to be learned from this story, that you have to feel comfortable sort of going out of your comfort zone and seeing what bubbles up. Because I think too, again, as I said before, say you find out while you're researching this in PubMed and decide to look at someplace else, you may find, hey, this is a really, prolific, specific problem in Afro-Caribbean cultures, okay? And you might not have been clued into that from the PubMed literature, because there's a lot of literature that doesn't make it into PubMed that's published around the world. You might not have, you might not, and then you start to think to yourself, whoa, wait a second, maybe I want to research this problem in a region specifically, or maybe I want to research it with teen pregnancy or geriatric pregnancy. I mean, it starts to get you thinking about the breadth of the problem in a way that sometimes the most obvious places won't provide you with that information. Does anyone else on the panel here want to give V some feedback?
Hi, V. I thought this was a very nice analysis on a very complex topic. So, and it's not very easy to find information that is interdisciplinary, especially when you're looking in the medical database, but trying to look at the problem from the social sciences angle as well. So I really see that your strings here seem very well thought out. With Google Scholar, I run into similar problems, even though my strings might be very specific, and in PubMed, they only give me like 50 articles. When I go to Google Scholar, I get thousands of articles. So that is just an artifact of the database, I think. But overall, great presentation. And one only thing I would think about is some of the concepts we learned in the book. For example, looking at what might be the conflicts of perspective and how do you find solutions within those conflicts. That would be ripe area for some additional research topics, I think. But again, I don't know enough about this topic, so very nice presentation. Thank you.
I would agree with Kalyan. I think what I got sort of an impression of here was you were trying to research a predefined topic and the disciplines that support it. You might think about we talked about this earlier this evening, the problem, and then use the literature from different disciplines to inform the questions you're going to ask about the problem. Like when you get into the habit of doing literature reviews, you do the literature review first, and then you decide what you're going to research, not the other way around. Because you need to know what's out there and what's not out there. You need to know where the holes in the Swiss cheese are. All right. So when we think of the different disciplines, that's where this adequacy piece comes in. I need to know enough to know, and which you did, you did. You said, okay, I can look to these different types of disciplines to inform what I'm looking at, but leave space for the fact that as you look at them, your ideas about what you're going to research are going to change. So you're not weeding them out because they have nothing to say about what you preconceived, but they're informing you about what you're about to research. Okay. So we're not here all night. I'm going to ask us to move on. You had the biggest group. I'm sorry about that. And Louis, thank you for waiting so long. Last but not least, V, could you take your slides down? So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, home stretch here. Sorry, guys. You were the biggest group.
No worries.
And I think Dr. Lee's plane to Hawaii took off.
Oh, wow. She's going to Hawaii.
Unfortunately for family matter.
Oh.
But yeah, she's been making it west over the last couple days. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay,
well,
we're ready when you are.
All right. Well, last but not least, here I am. And it's been such a pleasure listening to all your presentations. And I must admit, I've been cheating and updating my slides and incorporating everyone's feedbacks and your ideas. So I think it's a blessing in disguise that I'm last. So my research is really conducting a cross-disciplinary clinical trial research to really improve the informed consent process for participants. And I would like to preface this by describing a story where a patient may have a particular disease and they go into their doctor's office and they're just overwhelmed with so many issues. Their family issues, logistical issues, just the hospital logistics, and then getting a time with their providers, being able to answer or ask questions and getting answers, and really ultimately making a quote informed decision to their treatment. So really, oh, sorry, let me minimize your beautiful faces. Really just finding the difficulties in fully comprehending the nature of the complex investigative clinical trials, such as the scientific rationale, informations. There might be an inability to really concentrate in that time or that given high environmental stress. And this is also additional factors would include limited time and pressure making informed decisions. So really, how can we improve this informed consent process to really increase the understanding in clinical trials? Now, really a justification of using a cross-disciplinary approach is later you'll find out that there are multiple disciplines and stakeholders, but primarily disciplines that span across a wide variety of disciplines that really help or are involved in either the implementation or the process in the institutional pre-consent process or complexity issue of this informed consent issue. There's not a single discipline that can really solve this issue. In order to really help process and find an issue, find a solution to this issue, we really do want to promote early trust building communications and incorporations of key stakeholders and disciplines in order to make it really patient centric and try to figure out how to go about in benefiting all disciplines. And really a solution is needed to provide a more seamless experience for the overall experience for the participant, so that once the participant is included in all aspects of these decisions and be able to make an informed decision, we would potentially be able to solve all these issues across all the disciplines that they might be facing. So potential stakeholders, and I included the disciplines that are involved are the participants, which will be taking a psychological approach, parents, guardians, witnesses, family and friends, more of a sociological, ethical perspective. The research investigators, more of applied sciences. Really the ancillary team that's involved in the overall care is also applied sciences. Regulatory agencies, more along the social sciences. The director of clinical research, which is more in line with the economics of the whole operations. The sponsor of a given clinical trial, really focusing on the biology discipline of it. And the research investigators, the ancillary team schedulers, the research coordinators, all part of the applied sciences. So really taking a finite approach and trying to find the most relevant disciplines, I parsed them out to be the participants, the research investigators, the institutional leaders, or the director of clinical research and sponsors, respectively with their disciplines are psychology, more of an applied science, economics, and biology perspective. So here's my literature review through PubMed and Scopus, and what I found were, and this is what I added from all of your help, were some of the assumptions and gaps that were prevalent in these particular disciplines. For a participant or a psychological perspective, really the assumption is that they're really focused on the emotional aspect of the treatment, how they feel, what's going on. Really the gap within this particular discipline is really the basic understanding of the biological mechanisms that are involved in the clinical trial and the costs, the economic costs that an institution do have to pay in order for that care to be given in terms of a clinical trial standpoint. Really the research investigators, the applied science aspect or perspective is really the assumption that they're only focused solely on the outcome of the care and the results. And really the gap is the feeling anxiety that the participants are going through, and also the costs as well, as they're not very focused on the costs when it comes down to the deep research. In terms of the directors or the institutional leaders with an economic discipline or perspective, it's really the assumption that it's all based on the economics of the operations of clinical trials and really the cost, time, and efficiencies. And really in that gap, as they're 30,000 miles up in the air, having this bird eye view of the process, really the gap is really understanding the biological mechanisms of the clinical trial aspect and the emphasis of care and outcomes on that particular individual participant. In terms of the sponsor or the biological perspective or the biological discipline, it's really focused, the assumption is really focused on how the drug really works in a biological settings in terms of a clinical trial. But similarly to an economic standpoint, they might have that, a gap in terms of a sponsor's standpoint is really the emotions that each individual participant really feels as they're going through the process. And really the gap is really the emphasis on care of the individual participants. Now, really some of the challenges that are consulting in the disciplines are really having that participant knowledge of clinical trials and accessing comprehension of from a patient's perspective, aligning those patient adequacies and really providing that discipline or perspective to providers and sponsors. Really a challenge is really increasing the other stakeholders really not traditionally involved in the informed consent process, similar to the ancillary team or the director of clinical research, who don't really partake in the consenting of participants, really understanding the ethics involved or the coercions, really finding the finite issues of different perspectives of solving the problem. There is no common forum in which these stakeholders or disciplines can really take part in learning each other's roles and importance and their perspectives on how this process has gone about. And really a challenge is how to integrate these psychological, applied sciences, biological, and economic disciplines all in one setting. Now, really some next key steps based on the literature that I reviewed and some key reflection points are really to continue to do efficacy studies, efficiency studies, and effectiveness studies on the informed consent process from an economic, psychological, and applied science perspective. Additionally, we would want to try and use patient-reported outcomes on the pre-informed consent processes or elements of pre-conformed consent processes to really help aid in the understanding of decisions that patients need to make in the informed consent process that really alludes to the comprehension of clinical trials and how we can get there. Cross-functional trainings to really understand each relevant discipline's perspective and how we can align on those and incorporate those ideas and values. A medium to discuss and incorporate those multidisciplinary perspectives, and really recognizing the qualities of effective team science, as well as common goal planning, trust building, and a diverse team composition and acknowledging the key disciplines involved in the issue. And I think that's it.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone want to start? Okay, I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
Can you go back to your first slide again?
Yeah.
Okay, so the problem here is that if you're telling us that informed consent is difficult for participants to understand,
Mhm.
right? Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. Um, so if that's the problem, what what disciplinary science is going to inform that problem? So go to your fourth slide. Okay, excuse me, the slide before that. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Okay, first off, individuals do not represent disciplines.
Mhm.
Disciplines have an ethos and they look at problems with a very specific lens. So participants do not represent psychology.
Mhm.
Psychology may be a discipline that you draw from to understand what the psychology of a participant might be, if that's your question. I would really recommend to everyone not to break down disciplines to individual stakeholders. So, for instance, what do you mean by the director of clinical research represents economics?
I mean that a director uses an economics lens to see how the clinical trial process works and what are their goals and perspectives.
So are you saying that the only goal of a director of clinical research is an economic one?
Not necessarily, but a majority is. In my
Okay,
perspective.
but the point is, what are the tenets of economics that address the problem of participants' problems with filling out a consent?
The efficiency, the time that's needed to fill out that consent.
And the literature says that?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
Okay, you see, so, and I have a series of questions.
Mhm.
Also, we have to be careful of language.
Okay.
You've said disciplines don't, you said disciplines consult each other. Disciplines don't consult each other. Disciplines are traditions of science that you might draw on in which to put together some perspective to deal with the problem. If the question you have is, how do individuals cope with filling out consents, right? That's what
Mhm.
you're saying, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so the question would be not how do disciplines consult with each other? The question is, what disciplines inform your way of answering your question about that problem? And then so what do you mean by applied sciences? What science is that?
Medicine, health sciences.
They're all applied? I mean, because what you have here is MDs, DOs, DNPs,
Uh-huh.
applied sciences.
So they
Psychology has an aspect of it that's applied. So
I
does anthropology. So does economics. So is applied science part of your discipline that you've identified as having its own way of looking at a problem?
well, I initially put medicine, but maybe that might have been I thought it was a narrow scope, so I tried to make it more general. But would medicine be a more of appropriate discipline?
Well, I think where the confusion is here, and I think it's something that you misinterpreted in your reading, is that stakeholders do not represent disciplines. I do not represent team science. Team science is a field that draws on different disciplines, and I, as a researcher, will do cross-disciplinary work drawing on those different disciplines. I don't represent team science. You know, stakeholders are not representative of disciplines. See what I'm saying?
I see.
Okay, that would be, you know, different stakeholders might be involved. But the other problem here is that you're looking at the problem as if it's something to be solved by stakeholders instead of a question that needs to be researched. So if the question is, why do patients have trouble filling out the consent forms? The answer is not all the people that are involved need to fix it, which is what you're telling me here. Okay, you want to understand why. Why do people have problem completing the consent? Just do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
So there you might include, for instance, learning as science, education. You might include, if you're looking at the problem from a perspective of health literacy, possibly. These are the areas that are going to help you understand why a person may have trouble completing that consent. Could you also look a little further into the assumptions? It's your slide 7. The assumptions are, the assumptions are not the assumptions of individuals, they're the assumptions of the disciplines. So you put participants, assumption that social science is focused on the emotional aspects of treatment. That's not a true statement. Psychology, the assumption of psychology is not focused on the emotional aspects of treatment.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay, so you have to be careful here because, so assumption that applied sciences is focused solely on the outcome of the care and results. That makes no sense because applied sciences, I mean, you might say medicine, I'm not even sure that's entirely true. Medicine is focused solely on the outcome of care and results. That might be true, but that's also not a discipline, that's a practice. It doesn't tell us what the base assumption of the discipline is. Okay.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, there's some real confusion here, and I could talk about it with you more, but I think we all have to be careful. This is really a message to everyone, that when we talk about stakeholder engagement, we're talking about including people in the solving of a problem that have a direct investment in the problem. So in those cases, it's people that are either trying to solve research questions, trying to provide better care, they may have the problem themselves, they may have cancer, or they may be a caregiver. You know, that's investment in the problem. We're talking about disciplinary science as contributing to answering research questions. So that's representation of bodies of knowledge, not individuals or stakeholders.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Yes.
I think there's some confusion there. And I think just in general, be careful about language. Like when you say things like incorporating the disciplines in the setting, I don't know what that means. It sounds like you're saying the scientific disciplines somehow need to be incorporated in the regulatory setting, and that doesn't make any sense to me.
I see. Okay.
You see what I'm saying? Just be careful of how the language you're using. The other thing I touched on was patient adequacies. What are patient adequacies?
I guess I was trying to think about how the participants, I associate participants as the psychology discipline, which you said not to do now, to have one individual represent a whole discipline. And in terms of the discipline, the adequacies for that discipline. So
but that's not what adequacy means. According to the authors, adequacy is the researcher's ability to understand where to look across disciplines to include knowledge into what they're studying. So if you are by trade, for instance, your area of science revolves around radiology, let's just say, okay? And you want to do something having to do with neuroscience. Okay, well, you're not really trained in neuroscience, but you need to know enough about neuroscience to know what that brings to what you're studying. That's what the term adequacy means, okay? So that's not something that would be applied to any stakeholder. It's a skill that a researcher has. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, we're getting a little late here. I want to make sure anyone else who has anything to say about this presentation has some comments. I know we're getting late. I appreciate that. Michelle, did you want to say something?
No, nothing specific about the presentation.
Okay. Any thoughts? Anything?
Dr. L, as usual, this was a very nice learning experience.
Yeah, I tried to use everyone's different presentation to sort of tease out something different because it's hard, and we realized that this new way of doing this class, every class, is a little challenging. I thought by breaking it down into smaller groups, other than all of us doing it on the weekend, would make it a little bit more manageable, and I hope it did. Thank you all. I'm going to be, of course, providing my rubric feedback when you post your presentations. So your presentations, remember to post to the grade book, right? And then you want to post your feedback for each person, right, into the discussion board. I'll share with you.
So I have a question about that. I was uncertain as to whether we were posting feedback on the final or on this one. I guess I had interpreted this presentation to be more informal, to get feedback and to learn.
Right.
I wasn't quite sure at what point we were going to be completing that rubric and evaluating other people.
What I would say is I would use this experience as an opportunity to give some feedback to the people that you've observed. So, that'll just help them as they post their final presentation. And your final presentation, I think I asked for next Wednesday.
November 11th.
The 11th. What's today? Yeah, the 11th I think is next Wednesday, right? Yeah. So so it'll give some feedback to everyone who's presented, so they can incorporate that if they'd like. You don't have to, but I'm giving you an opportunity to sort of look back and think about what was said, the comments that were shared, and if you want to make some changes to the presentation. Okay.
So sorry, could you let us know where to post our slides for now?
Yes, in the grade book. If you go to the grade book.
Shouldn't it be in the assignments?
Yeah, let me show you where it's going to end up. Okay, so in the grade book, you'll see you have.
Sorry. We don't see that.
No, I know. I know. There's 3 places for you to put your assignments: assignment 1, 2, and 3. Okay, I have a faculty view. You have a student view.
Ah,
So when you go to the assignments, okay.
the assignment tab. Okay.
Yep.
We need to go to assignment 1. It's about, yeah.
And
Yep.
then you scroll down to assignment 1 and something pops up.
Saying, so actually this is what yours looks like. So let me go back again so you can see it. So you see where it says assignment 1, it's underlined.
Yep.
You click on it and you're brought to this page, which has the activity and all that stuff. And it says, write, attach file, browse your computer, you attach the file. So have you guys not posted anything to the gradebook for any class?
Yeah,
yet?
we are used to doing this. At least I'm used to doing this. So
Okay. Okay, so you go here to assignment 1 and browse your computer or wherever you have it, if you have it on cloud storage, whatever, and you just post it. So I'm not going to post anything here, but I would post a file and put open, it would attach, and then you submit it. Now for your feedback, you're going to put that, if you look to the emails that I sent you, the feedback is going to go to the discussion board.
Yeah,
So
I think that some groups got confused as to which group number they are.
yes, you're right. I wrote a message to, I think it's Hannah.
Because I think we're group 1, even though
You are group 1. Yeah, it's just the order. You are group 1. It's the order that you that we ended up having the meetings. Yeah, you are group 1.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. I'll deal with that later.
Okay.
Okay. Does that make sense? I know it's a little tricky to manage Blackboard. I know it's let me stop sharing. Does anyone have any questions? Any questions? Okay. Have a good night. Get sleep if you didn't get sleep last night for some reason. And I will see you on Saturday.
Yes.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Take care.
you.
All right.
Bye, everyone.